The world remembers Hedy Lamarr in light, not ordinary light, but the controlled, silvery light of old Hollywood, the kind that could turn a human face into mythology. In the portraits, she looks almost impossibly still. Dark hair parted with architectural precision, eyes that seem to hold a secret, skin photographed like marble. The face is so perfect that it becomes difficult to believe there was a person behind it at all. That was the danger of being Hedy Lamarr. The world looked at her and decided what she was before she had a chance to tell it who she was. To movie audiences, she was the mysterious beauty from Europe. The woman whose face could stop a scene before a line was spoken. To studio executives, she was a visual treasure, a rare object that could be dressed, lit, and sold. To Oxop colonists, she was romance, scandal, and foreign glamour. To men, she was often treated less like a mine than a prize. But in a quieter room, far from the studio lights, Hedy Lamarr was not only studying scripts or preparing for a close-up. She was thinking about signal interference, torpedoes, radio frequencies, and how to make a military communication system harder to jam. While the public admired the curve of her mouth, she and composer George Antheil were developing an idea that would one day be connected to the foundations of modern wireless communication. The contradiction is almost too perfect to seem real. Hollywood called her one of the most beautiful women in the world. History would later discover that she had also been one of the most underestimated minds in the room. But recognition arrived late. For most of her life, the invention was treated as a footnote if it was mentioned at all. The beauty came first. The beauty came loudest. The beauty followed her everywhere, like a spotlight she could not step out of. It opened doors. But it also narrowed every room she entered. People were so busy staring that they did not listen. That is where Hedy Lamarr's story begins. Not with a birth date, not with a studio contract, not with a film title, but with an injustice wrapped in glamour. A woman could be placed before the world as an object of desire and, at the same time, be quietly imagining a technology beyond the understanding of many of the men who dismissed her. Her life was not simply a tale of fame, invention, and belated honor. It was a story about exile, control, reinvention, loneliness, and the cruelty of being reduced to the thing other people found easiest to understand. The world saw the face. It missed the mind. And by the time it finally understood what Hedy Lamarr had carried inside her, the woman behind the image had already spent a lifetime paying the price of being looked at, but not seen.
The image everyone remembers is not subtle. Hedy Lamarr enters public memory as a vision of impossible beauty, one of those old Hollywood faces that seems to belong less to a person than to an era. In the late 1930s and 1940s, when studios still built stars with the precision of empires, Hedy became a symbol of European mystery remade for American fantasy. She had the kind of face that photographers loved because it required almost nothing, and yet gave them everything MGM knew what it had. The studio specialized in manufacturing dreams, and Hedy seemed like a dream that had arrived already polished. She could be placed in an evening gown, set beneath a soft light, and made to appear not merely beautiful, but untouchable. She carried a silence that Hollywood interpreted as elegance. She carried distance that audiences interpreted as mystery. She carried intelligence that the industry too often mistook for coldness. Her films placed her beside major stars and inside elaborate worlds of romance, adventure, and spectacle. In Algiers, her American breakthrough, she appeared as the alluring foreign presence whose beauty seemed to haunt the frame. Later came films such as Boomtown, Ziegfeld Girl, White Cargo, and Samson and Delilah, each adding another layer to the public image. She was not always given roles equal to her intelligence, but she was given what Hollywood knew how to give a woman like her: radiance, costumes, close-ups, desire. To audiences, Hedy Lamarr seemed to have everything a woman could want in that world. She had fame, she had wealth, she had admiration. She had a face that could make strangers whisper. She moved through a cinematic universe built for worship, and the worship was real. Fan magazines wrote about her beauty as if it were an event. Publicity departments understood that the image needed no explanation. The camera loved her so completely that it made the rest of her seem unnecessary. That was the trap. The more the world admired her beauty, the less curious it became about her interior life. The glamour was so persuasive that it swallowed complexity. Hedy became a screen goddess, but a goddess is not allowed to be restless, bored, inventive, wounded, or angry. A goddess is supposed to be admired from a distance. She is not supposed to ask to be understood, yet there were always clues that the image was incomplete. Her stillness could look like glamour, but it also suggested containment. Her famous face could appear serene, but behind it was a woman who had crossed continents, escaped a suffocating marriage, and carried knowledge of a Europe moving toward catastrophe. She was not simply decorative, she was observant. She watched systems, machines, men, power, and war. She had seen enough to know that beauty could protect a woman in one room and endanger her in another. The public remembered Hedy Lamarr as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. The tragedy is that for too long it remembered almost nothing else.
Before she became Hedy Lamarr, she was Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler, born in Vienna in 1914 into a cultured Jewish family in a city that still carried the elegance of old Europe. Vienna was not Hollywood. It was music, cafes, manners, opera houses, intellectual conversation, and the fading shimmer of an imperial world that had lost its empire, but not its taste for refinement. Hedy grew up in an environment where beauty and intellect were both present, though they were not valued equally when they appeared in a young girl. Her father, Emil Kiesler, was a bank director. Her mother, Gertrude, had been trained as a pianist. The household offered comfort, sophistication, and access to culture, but privilege is not the same as emotional freedom. From childhood, Hedy was curious. She liked to understand how things worked. Her father reportedly encouraged this curiosity, taking walks with her and explaining mechanical systems, printing presses, streetcars, and the hidden structures behind ordinary life. Those early conversations mattered. Long before she was praised for her face, she had been taught to look beneath surfaces. That instinct would become one of the defining tensions of her life. The world would later treat Hedy herself as a surface. It would admire the exterior and ignore the mechanism inside. But as a child, she had already learned that the visible world was only the beginning. Behind the streetcar was engineering. Behind music was structure. Behind power was design. Behind beauty, too, there might be a mind working in silence. Still, Hedy entered adolescence in a culture that knew how to notice a beautiful girl quickly. Her looks attracted attention early, and attention can become a kind of training. A child who is told she is beautiful learns that beauty is not only a compliment, it is a responsibility. It changes the way adults look, the way strangers behave, the way opportunity arrives, and the way danger disguises itself. Her earliest wound was not poverty, as it had been for many Hollywood stars. It was a different kind of wound, the wound of being seen and not fully known. In a comfortable world with high expectations, Hedy discovered that beauty could people underestimate the very intelligence that made her most alive. Then Europe began to darken. The Vienna of Hedy's youth was not separate from history. Anti-Semitism, political extremism, and the growing threat of fascism were not distant abstractions. They formed the background to her early adulthood. Her Jewish heritage, later complicated by Hollywood reinvention and public presentation, placed her inside a world where identity could become dangerous. She was young, ambitious, and eager for life, but the ground beneath Europe was shifting. Acting first appeared as escape and expression. It offered movement, performance, transformation. It allowed her to become someone else before others could decide who she was. But even in the beginning, performance came with exposure. Her early role in the European film Ecstasy made her famous and controversial, not only for her acting, but for the way the film presented sexuality and the female body. Once again, the world looked at Hedy and argued about what it saw. Rarely did it ask what she thought. The wound had taken shape. She was intelligent, but discussed as beautiful. She was curious, but desired as an image. She was a young woman in a dangerous century, but treated as a spectacle. The pattern that would define her Hollywood life had already begun in Europe. Hedy Lamarr would spend decades escaping rooms built by other people. The first of those rooms was the belief that beauty was the most important thing about her.
Hedy's first escape looked, from the outside, like success. As a young actress in Europe, she found the stage and screen at a moment when her beauty could open doors quickly. Her role in Ecstasy made her internationally known, but it also turned her into a subject of controversy. The film's reputation followed her. making her seem daring, sensual, and scandalous before many people had seen enough of her work to understand the actress beneath the legend. Fame arrived early, and with it came judgment. Then came Friedrich Mandl. Mandl was wealthy, powerful, and connected to the arms industry. He moved in circles where money, politics, weapons, and influence converged. To a young woman, he may have seemed at first like protection, a man with status, resources, and the ability to place a wall between her and the chaos of public scrutiny. But protection can become possession when the person's offering it believes wealth gives him the right to control the life of another. Their marriage became a cage. Accounts of Hedy's life describe Mandl as controlling, jealous, and determined to withdraw her from the career that had made her visible. She found herself surrounded by luxury, but luxury without freedom is only a more expensive prison. The rooms were elegant, the dinners were important. The guests included powerful men. Yet inside that world, Hedy was not free to be fully herself. She listened, she observed. She absorbed conversations about weapons, communications, military technology, and the machinery of war. The irony is profound. The marriage that attempted to confine her also exposed her to ideas that would later help shape her most important invention. While men treated her as ornament, Hedy was learning. She was listening in rooms where she was not expected to think. The world underestimated her, and that underestimation became a kind of cover. But she could not remain. By 1937, with Europe moving toward catastrophe and her bird suffocating her future, Hedy escaped. The details have been retold with varying levels of drama, but the emotional truth is clear. She left behind a life of wealth and control because survival required motion. She reached London, where fate placed her near Louis B. Mayer of the man who could open the gates of Hollywood. Mayer did not offer freedom in any pure sense. Hollywood had its own cages. But to Hedy, after Mandl, America represented reinvention. A new name, a new contract, a new continent, a new version of herself that might finally belong to her. Hedwig Kiesler became Hedy Lamarr. The transformation was cinematic, but it was not simple. A woman fleeing a controlling marriage and a darkening Europe was now entering another system controlled largely by men. MGM would offer fame, money, and a global audience. It would also reduce her, package her, and decide which parts of her were profitable. Her beauty would be celebrated. Her intelligence would be treated as almost inconvenient. Still, the first escape mattered. Hedy had refused to remain a beautiful possession in someone else's house. She had crossed borders, changed names, and chosen uncertainty over captivity. For a while, Hollywood looked like liberation. But Hollywood, too, had a way of locking doors from the inside.
When Hedy Lamarr arrived in Hollywood, the world opened in a blaze of controlled light. MGM knew how to announce a woman. It knew how to turn foreignness into mystery, biography into publicity, pain into romance, and reinvention into myth. Hedy's past was softened, rearranged, and made usable. The scandal of ecstasy was both a problem and an asset. Her European origins gave her allure. Her face did the rest. In Algiers, American audiences saw her as if she had stepped out of a dream. The film did not merely introduce Hedy Lamarr, it framed her as an apparition. She was cool, elegant, and remote. With a beauty that seemed to belong to another continent and another emotional temperature. Charles Boyer had the dramatic role, but Hedy had the face audiences remembered. Hollywood understood the value of that face immediately. The studio placed her in roles that emphasized glamour, sensuality, and mystery. She appeared with major male stars, moved through elaborate productions, and became one of the beauties of her time. In Boomtown, she appeared alongside Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy. In Ziegfeld Girl, she existed inside MGM's pageant of feminine spectacle. In White Cargo, she was given a role steeped in exoticism and desire. A reminder of how narrow Hollywood's imagination could be when faced with a woman it considered too beautiful to complicate. Her most commercially famous triumph came with Samson and Delilah, Cecil B. DeMille's grand biblical spectacle. As Delilah, Hedy became once more the dangerous beauty, the woman whose face could alter the fate of men. The film was a major success, and to the public it seemed to confirm everything Hollywood had been saying about her for years. She was not merely beautiful, she was mythic, but mythology is a lonely place to live. The world wanted Hedy to remain a perfect image, and perfection leaves little room for human contradiction. She could be bored, she could be restless. She could be funny, impatient, inventive, and deeply frustrated. But the studio did not know what to do with those qualities unless they could be translated into glamour. The parts offered to her rarely matched the scale of her mind. She was asked to stand still and be magnificent when what she wanted was to build, solve, test, and understand. Even success became a kind of confinement. Hedy's fame gave her money, power, and visibility. It allowed her to support causes, meet influential people, and live inside a world of privilege. But it also made the misunderstanding more severe. The more beautiful she became in the public imagination, the harder it was for people to accept that she might also be technically inventive. Her intelligence seemed to disrupt the fantasy. A goddess was not supposed to be practical. A screen siren was not supposed to talk about torpedoes. That was the cruelty of the image. It elevated her and erased her at the same time. The world opened for Hedy Lamarr, but only the part of the world that knew how to admire her face. The other world, the world of invention, recognition, and intellectual respect, remained only partly open, waiting behind a door Hollywood barely noticed.
The person who changed everything was not a lover, not a director, not a studio executive, and not one of the powerful men who tried to define Hedy Lamarr. It was George Antheil. Antheil was an American composer, experimental, eccentric, and used to thinking in patterns that did not obey conventional rules. He was not an engineer in the formal military sense, and Hedy was not a formally trained scientist. On paper, they were an unlikely pair to enter the history of communications and technology. A Hollywood actress and an avant-garde composer did not look like the people expected to imagine a wartime invention. That was precisely why the story matters. Hedy had been carrying ideas for a long time. She had learned about weapons and military systems during her marriage to Mandel. She had watched Europe descend into war. She had fled a world threatened by fascism. In America, she was safe, famous, and admired. But safety did not make her indifferent. She wanted to help. During World War II, like many Hollywood stars, she participated in war bond efforts, using her celebrity for patriotic causes. But selling bonds did not fully satisfy the part of her that wanted to solve a problem directly. The problem involved radio-controlled torpedoes. A torpedo guided by radio could be jammed if the enemy located and interfered with the signal. Hedy imagined a way for the signal to jump across frequencies, making it far more difficult to block. It was an elegant idea. Do not stay still where the enemy expects you. Move, shift, become harder to catch. There is something almost autobiographical in that concept. Hedy had survived by moving from Vienna to London to Hollywood, from Hedwig Kiesler to Hedy Lamarr, from controlled wife to international star. She understood escape not as theory, but as experience. Frequency hopping, in another language, was a system of survival through unpredictability. Antheil brought a musical imagination to the problem. His work with player pianos helped shape the idea of synchronized shifts, a mechanical way for transmitter and receiver to move together across frequencies. Together, Lamarr and Antheil developed what became known as a secret communication system. They received a patent in 1942. But the world was not ready to hear it from them. The Navy did not immediately adopt the system. The technology of the time made implementation difficult, and the idea came from people the military establishment did not naturally recognize as technical authorities. Hedy's fame, instead of helping, may have made the invention easier to dismiss. She was a movie star. She was beautiful. She was supposed to sell war bonds, not propose communications systems. The encounter with Antheil changed Hedy's legacy, even if the change was not visible immediately. It proved that the intellect Hollywood ignored was not a fantasy invented later to make her seem more interesting. It was real, it was active. It was working while the public stared at her face. But the relationship between Hedy and recognition would remain painfully uneven. She had helped create something forward-looking, then watched as the world largely forgot. The invention existed, but the inventor was still trapped beneath the image. The woman who had imagined a signal that could not easily be jammed found that her own voice, in a different way, had been jammed by beauty, sexism, and celebrity. George Antheil helped bring one of Hedy's most brilliant ideas into form, but even he could not make the world listen in time. The first warning came quietly, through dismissal. It did not look like tragedy at first. It looked like a polite refusal, a bureaucratic delay, a military system uninterested in the idea of a movie star. It looked like men smiling at Hedy Lamarr, as though her patriotism was charming, her beauty useful, and her intelligence somehow out of place. That kind of dismissal can be difficult dramatized because it leaves no single wound. There is no door slammed in one unforgettable scene. There is no villain with one cruel line that explains everything. Instead, there is the slow accumulation of being underestimated. The repeated experience of entering a room with an idea and watching people respond first to the face. Hedy had known this feeling before. In Europe, her beauty had made her visible and vulnerable. In marriage, it had helped turn her into a possession. In Hollywood, it had made her rich and famous but also typecast. Now, even in the world of invention, the same pattern appeared. The surface arrived before the substance. The image interrupted the mind. The secret communication system she developed with George Antheil was not treated as the breakthrough it would later seem to be. The Navy did not immediately use it. Hedy was encouraged, in effect, to contribute in the way a beautiful actress was expected to contribute, by raising money, drawing crowds, and selling the war effort with her presence. She did those things, but they were not the whole of what she had offered. The warning was not only that the world failed to adopt her invention. The warning was that it had no category for her. A woman could be brilliant if she looked a certain way, behaved a certain way, and came from an approved institution. A movie star could be useful if she smiled, appeared, and inspired patriotic spending. But a glamorous actress proposing a technical solution to a wartime communications problem disrupted too many assumptions at once. So the idea slipped into the background, and Hedy returned to the image. That return must have carried a private bitterness. She still had to report to sets, wear costumes, learn lines, and inhabit roles that often required far less intelligence than she possessed. She still had to sit for photographs that turned her into an object of admiration while another, deeper part of her waited for recognition that did not come. The contrast between public worship and intellectual dismissal grew sharper. This was one of the cruelest warnings in her life. Success in one form can prevent people from seeing success in another. Because Hedy was famous for beauty, her mind became almost unbelievable to the public. Because she was a movie star, her technical imagination seemed like a novelty. Because she had been turned into a fantasy, her practical contributions could be ignored without the world feeling it had lost anything. But something had been lost. A woman had offered an idea ahead of its time, and the time refused to admit that she might be ahead of it.
The price of Hedy Lamarr's glamour was not simply that people stared. It was that staring became a substitute for listening. The public admiration of Hedy was enormous. But admiration can be a cage when it leaves no room for the person admired to be anything other than the object of admiration. She was praised as beautiful until beauty became a wall around her. She was described in language that made her seem almost supernatural, but the more unreal she seemed, the less human sympathy she received. Hollywood rewarded the image and neglected the interior life. A studio could spend money on gowns, lighting, publicity, and elaborate sets, but it could not always imagine a role large enough for her intelligence. Hedy wanted stimulation. She invented at home. She sketched, experimented, and thought about practical solutions. She reportedly considered ideas ranging from improved traffic signals to dissolvable tablets for flavored drinks. Her mind did not rest easily. It moved toward problems because problems gave her something beauty could not give: agency. On screen, however, agency was limited. Again and again, she was framed as the woman men desired, pursued, feared, or betrayed. The roles varied in costume and setting, but the function often remained similar. She was the beautiful center of male obsession. She was the lure, the temptation, the mystery. The world called this glamour, but glamour, when repeated too often, can become erasure with better lighting. The personal cost was also severe. Hedy's marriages and relationships became part of the public story, often reduced to gossip, glamour, and failure. She married multiple times, and the fact itself became an easy shorthand in later retellings, as if the number of marriages explained the emotional life behind them. But to view it only that way is to miss the deeper ache. Hedy had escaped control once and spent years searching for connection without surrendering herself again. That is not vanity. It is a difficult human contradiction. She wanted love, but she also wanted freedom. She wanted to be admired, but not possessed. She wanted security, but not captivity. Those desires do not always coexist peacefully, especially for a woman whose public image attracted men who often came toward the legend before they understood the woman. Beauty brought attention, but attention was not always tenderness. Fame brought access, but access was not intimacy. Money brought comfort, but comfort was not peace. As the years passed, the same beauty that had made her career became something Hollywood measured against time. The industry that worshipped her youth was not gentle as she aged. Old Hollywood actresses often faced a cruel bargain: remain eternally beautiful or be treated as if the spell had failed. Hedy, whose image had been built so relentlessly around physical perfection, felt that pressure intensely. The world had loved her face almost violently. Then it watched that face change. That kind of scrutiny can distort a life. It can turn mirrors into enemies and photographs into evidence. It can make a woman feel that her value is being revised downward by times itself. For Hedy, the fear of losing beauty was not shallow. It was tied to survival, identity, and the system that had taught her what the world would reward. The price of glamour was that people mistook the gift for the whole person. They celebrated the face that brought her fame while ignoring the mind that wanted to be useful. They remembered the goddess while overlooking the inventor. They consumed the fantasy while leaving the woman inside it increasingly alone. Hedy Lamarr did not suffer because she was beautiful. She suffered because beauty became the only language many people used to speak about her.
The event that changed everything did not arrive in the form of one public scandal. It arrived in the form of time. For Hedy Lamarr, time was the force Hollywood could not control. It moved through the studio system, through the camera lens, through marriages, roles, contracts, and reputations. It changed the industry that had created her. It changed what audiences wanted. It changed how women were photographed, valued, discarded, and remembered. By the 1950s, the world that had made Hedy a goddess was shifting. The studio system was weakening. The old machinery of star creation, with its iron contracts and carefully managed myths, was losing power. A new Hollywood was beginning to emerge, rougher, younger, less committed to the kind of polished glamour that had defined her era. Hedy was still famous. She was still beautiful. But fame, especially for women in Hollywood, is rarely allowed to remain stable. It must be continually renewed, and renewal moves harder when the industry has built your value around youth, history, and physical perfection. Her career began to narrow. The roles became less important. The mythology remained, but mythology cannot substitute for creative fulfillment. To the public, she was still Hedy Lamarr, but inside the industry, the parts that once seemed designed for her were disappearing. The woman who had been presented as timeless was learning that Hollywood's idea of timelessness often lasted only as long as youth did. At the same time, her invention remained largely unrecognized. This combination is what makes the turning point so painful. Hedy was losing the very currency Hollywood had taught her to rely on, while the deeper form of her value still had not been acknowledged. The beauty was aging. The mind was still waiting. There is no single photograph that can fully capture that kind of loss. It happens gradually, then suddenly. One year the scripts are fewer. One year the calls are less urgent. One year the public begins to speak of a star in the past tense while she is still alive. One year the face in the mirror no longer matches the face that everyone else insists on remembering. For Hedy, the later years brought legal problems, financial strain, public misunderstandings, and an increasing withdrawal from the world that had once celebrated her. Her 1966 autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, became controversial, and Hedy later distanced herself from parts of it, saying it did not accurately represent her. Once again, others had taken control of her story, shaping her cry life into something more sensational than truthful. That was another kind of theft. A woman already reduced by beauty was now reduced by narrative. Her life was packaged as scandal, sexuality, and eccentricity, while the substance of her inventions remained mostly in the shadows. The public was still being offered the easiest version of Hedy Lamarr, not the most complete one. The event that changed everything then was not only the fading of film stardom, it was the moment when the image began to fail her,
and the world still had not learned how to honor what lay beyond it.
After the glamour receded, Hedy Lamarr did not disappear all at once. She retreated slowly, as many stars of the Golden Age did, from one circle of attention to another, from public appearances to private rooms, from the mythology of the screen to the more difficult reality of age. The world that had once demanded her presence became increasingly uncertain about what to do with her. Old fame is a strange possession. It follows a person everywhere, but it does not always keep them company. It can bring recognition without intimacy, nostalgia without support, and curiosity without compassion. People remember what a star looked like at 28, and seem faintly disappointed that time has continued. They want the image preserved, not the person changed. Hedy felt that cruelty deeply. Her later life became marked by isolation, disputes, financial concerns, and the consequences of being publicly remembered in fragments. There were arrests for shoplifting that drew attention not only because of the acts themselves, but because they seemed so startling when attached to a woman once considered one of the most glamorous in the world. To the public, these incidents were treated as strange, sad footnotes. But behind them was a larger unraveling. The difficulty of living after the identity the world gave you begins to collapse. She became more private, more guarded, more distant from the Hollywood world that had never fully understood her. The old portraits still circulated, but the woman herself increasingly avoided being photographed. That too makes emotional sense. When the public has worshipped your face for decades, aging becomes not merely private change, but public evidence. Every photograph threatens comparison with a ghost, and Hedy was haunted by her own ghost. The young woman from Algiers, Boomtown, and Samson and Delilah remained forever available on film, untouched by time. That Hedy could not suffer, could not age, could not argue, could not correct the record. She could only continue being beautiful in repetition. The living Hedy, meanwhile, had to endure the gap between the myth and the body, the legend and the loneliness. Yet even in the unraveling, there was something stubbornly alive in her. She did not stop thinking. She did not stop being sharp. She did not become the empty relic some people imagined. The mind remained, even if the world had arrived too late to honor it properly. Those who spoke with her later in life often encountered not only fragility, but wit, pride, intelligence, and the fierce sensitivity of someone who knew exactly how she had been underestimated. The belated recognition began to come near the end. In the 1990s, as historians, technologists, and advocates began revisiting the story of her invention, Hedy received honors that acknowledged what Hollywood had long ignored. The Electronic Frontier Foundation recognized her contribution. The world started to connect her name with frequency, hopping, and spread spectrum communication. Journalists began asking not only how beautiful she had been, but how brilliant. But late recognition carries its own sadness. It confirms the injustice even as it corrects it. It tells the world that a woman was valuable all along, but only after she has spent most of her life being treated otherwise. It restores part of the story, but not the years lost to misunderstanding. Hedy Lamarr's unraveling was not the collapse of a mind. It was the collapse of a public illusion that had never been large enough to contain her.
In the final chapter of Hedy Lamarr's life, the noise faded, the studios were gone. The premieres were memories. The men who had once tried to possess, promote, desire, define, or dismiss her had receded into history. The face remained famous, but the woman lived largely away from the world that had made that face into legend. She spent her later years in Florida, far from the old Hollywood geography of studio gates and Beverly Hills parties. Distance can be peaceful, but it can also be lonely. For Hedy, who had crossed continents and identities, the final distance carried an almost symbolic weight. Vienna was far behind her. MGM was far behind her. The age that had called her the most beautiful woman in the world was now an archive of still photographs and late-night screenings. The recognition for her invention did come before her death, and that matters. She knew, at least in part, that the world had begun to understand what it had missed. Honors in the 1990s acknowledged the secret communication system she and George Antheil had created decades earlier. The story of the beautiful actress who had also been an inventor began to circulate with new seriousness.
But recognition cannot return a life to the moment when it should have been received. It cannot give Hedy the roles she was never offered. It cannot undo the years in which her intelligence was treated as an amusing contradiction. It cannot erase the loneliness of being trapped inside a face so famous that it overshadowed the person behind it. It cannot repair every misunderstanding, every reduction, every room where men heard her name and thought first of desire instead of ideas. She died on January 19, 2000, at her home in Florida. She was 85. There is something quietly devastating about that ending. A woman who had once been photographed as though she were immortal died far from the mythology that had made her famous. Her death marked the passing not only of a star, but of a contradiction Hollywood had never resolved. She had been one of its great beauties, and also one of its great failures of imagination. The public reaction was respectful, but the full meaning of her life continued to unfold after she was gone. Posthumous recognition grew. Her name entered conversations about women in science, hidden inventors, overlooked genius, and the ways history sometimes buries intelligence beneath appearance. In 2014, her induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame helped cement what she had deserved decades earlier. A place not only in cinema history, but in the history of technological imagination. Still, the final image is not an award. It is Hedy in silence, older, private, and far from the gaze that once followed her everywhere. It is a woman who had been adored by millions, yet spent much of her life trying to convince the world that she was more than the thing it adored. The tragedy is not that Hedy Lamarr died forgotten. The tragedy is that she had to wait so long to be remembered correctly.
What the world got wrong about Hedy Lamarr was the belief that beauty made her easy to understand. Beauty, in her case, made the misunderstanding deeper. It gave people a simple story to tell, and simple stories are often the most difficult to dislodge. She was beautiful, therefore she was glamorous. She was glamorous, therefore she was lucky. She was lucky, therefore her pain did not require much sympathy. She was a movie star, therefore her intelligence seemed like an accessory rather than a central truth. Every step in that logic was wrong. Hedy was not only a face. She was a survivor of a controlling marriage, an emigrant from a Europe descending into war, a woman who reinvented herself under pressure, a star who understood the limits of stardom, and an inventor whose most important idea was dismissed, partly because it came from the wrong kind of person. The world also got her glamour wrong. It imagined glamour as ease. But Hedy's glamour required discipline, control, and constant exposure. It brought admiration, but admiration was not the same as respect. It brought wealth, but wealth was not the same as freedom. It brought fame, but fame was not the same as being known. Most of all, the world got her intelligence wrong. It treated her invention as a surprising contradiction. As a beautiful woman thinking seriously about technology were a delightful exception to the natural order. But the contradiction existed only in the prejudices of the people looking at her. Hedy had always been curious. She had always watched systems beneath surfaces. The mind was not a late revelation. It had been there from the beginning. The real scandal of Hedy Lamarr's life was not that a movie star invented something important. The real scandal was that so many people found it hard to believe she could.
What remains of Hedy Lamarr is no longer only the face. The face remains, of course. It survives in the photographs, the film stills, the old posters, the close-ups that made her seem eternal. It is still one of the great faces of the Hollywood Golden Age, a face that helped define the studio dream at its most polished and unreal. But now, beside the face, there is the mind. That is the victory history finally gave her. Not fully, not soon enough, but powerfully. Hedy Lamarr is remembered today not only as the woman once called the most beautiful in the world, but as an inventor whose wartime idea helped anticipate the future of secure wireless communication. The story has become almost symbolic. The screen goddess, who was also a technical thinker, the glamour icon whose genius was hidden in plain sight, her legacy asks us to look differently. It asks us to question how many people have been reduced by the easiest thing to notice about them. It asks how many women were praised for beauty while their minds went unheard. It asks how often history mistakes visibility for recognition. Fame gave Hedy Lamarr wealth, admiration, and immortality on film. It also trapped her inside an image too narrow for her intelligence. The world looked at her for decades, and Sony dreamed the truth was more interesting. She was not merely beautiful, she was not merely tragic, she was not merely overlooked. She was a woman of contradiction, brilliance, pride, of vulnerability, and restless imagination, moving through a century that knew how to photograph her but not how to understand her. And that is why Hedy Lamarr still matters. Because her story reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the room is not what everyone is staring at. Sometimes it is what they refuse to see.